The chrome and steel corridors of Hunter Station Omega hummed with the collective energy of 1,000 different species, each one representing the deadliest predators their respective worlds had to offer. The station itself was a marvel of engineering, suspended in the void between three dying stars, its massive bulk serving as the galaxy's premier training facility for those brave or foolish enough to hunt the creatures that lurked in the dark spaces between worlds. Marcus Chen adjusted the collar of his standard-issue training suit as he walked through the main corridor, acutely aware of the stares and whispered comments that followed in his wake. His boots made soft sounds against the metal flooring, a stark contrast to the clicking of chitinous legs, the scraping of scaled feet, and the heavy thumps of various other appendages that belonged to his fellow trainees. A group of Krelnath warriors passed by, their reptilian features twisted into expressions of barely concealed amusement. One of them, a particularly large specimen with scars crisscrossing his emerald scales, made a comment in their guttural language that caused his companions to emit what passed for laughter among their kind. Marcus didn't need to understand the words to know they were discussing his presence here. He had been expecting this reception. Humans were relatively new to the galactic community, having only made first contact 47 years ago. In that short time, they had established themselves as competent engineers, decent diplomats, and surprisingly effective merchants. But warriors, hunters? The very suggestion was met with the kind of polite skepticism usually reserved for children claiming they could pilot starships. The training facility's main hall opened up before him, like a cathedral dedicated to violence. The ceiling stretched up for nearly 100 meters, its surface covered with viewing screens that displayed real-time footage from hunting expeditions across the galaxy. The walls were lined with trophy cases, containing the preserved remains of creatures so dangerous that their very names were spoken in hushed tones across civilized space. At the center of the hall stood a raised platform where Commander Zixara held court. The Vextai were among the most respected hunters in the galaxy, and Zixara was considered one of their finest. Her chitinous exoskeleton gleamed under the artificial lights, its natural blue-black coloration enhanced by decorative scarring that told the story of countless successful hunts. Her forearms moved with practiced precision as she addressed a group of new recruits, each gesture calculated to convey both authority and deadly capability. Marcus made his way to the edge of the group, noting how the other trainees unconsciously shifted away from him. It wasn't malicious exactly, more like a natural instinct to maintain distance from something they perceived as weak or diseased. He had grown accustomed to such reactions during his journey to the station. Today marks the beginning of your transformation from whatever you were in your previous lives to what you will become as Hunter Corps operatives. Zixara's voice carried clearly across the hall, her words translated in real time by the neural implants all trainees received upon arrival. Some of you come from warrior cultures. Others are natural predators. A few of you, her compound eyes seemed to focus directly on Marcus, are here for reasons I cannot fathom. A ripple of amusement passed through the assembled group. Marcus kept his expression neutral, having learned long ago that showing emotion in such situations only made things worse. Zixara continued her speech, outlining the rigorous training regimen that awaited them. The Hunter Corps didn't just hunt any creatures. They specialized in the things that made even hardened soldiers wake up screaming. Void stalkers that could phase through solid matter to reach their prey. Nightmare spawners that fed on fear itself, growing stronger with each terrified thought. Quantum predators that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, making them nearly impossible to track or kill. The mortality rate for Hunter Corps trainees is approximately 60 to 8%, Zixara announced, with the casual tone of someone discussing the weather. This is not because we are careless with your lives, but because the creatures we hunt do not distinguish between the prepared and the unprepared. They kill with equal enthusiasm. She gestured to one of the trophy cases, where the preserved head of something that looked like a cross between a spider and a black hole hung suspended in a containment field. The entropy weaver displayed there killed 14 fully trained hunters before we brought it down. It could unravel the molecular bonds of anything it touched, turning living beings into component atoms in a matter of seconds. Marcus studied the trophy with professional interest. The creature's multifaceted eyes seemed to track his movement even in death, and he could see why it had proven so difficult to kill. Its hunting strategy would have relied on terror and confusion, using its horrifying ability to literally disintegrate prey to panic other potential victims into making fatal mistakes. Training begins immediately, Zixara announced. You will be divided into hunting pairs. Your partner's survival may depend on your competence, and your survival will certainly depend on theirs. Choose wisely. The assembled trainees began to mill about, sizing each other up and forming alliances based on species compatibility and perceived competence. Marcus remained where he was, knowing that approaching any of the other trainees would likely result in polite but firm rejection. Better to wait and see who, if anyone, would be willing to work with the token human. As expected, the pairing process proceeded without him. Vextai partnered with other arthropod species, finding common ground in their shared hunting methodologies. The Kelnath formed bonds with fellow reptilians, their cold-blooded efficiency complementing each other perfectly. Various mammalian species found partnerships based on pack-hunting instincts or similar social structures. Within 30 minutes, Marcus found himself standing alone in the center of the hall while everyone else had formed their teams. The situation was both embarrassing and predictable, but he had prepared for this possibility. "It appears we have an uneven number of trainees," Sixara observed, her mandibles clicking in what Marcus was beginning to recognize as Vextai amusement. "How unusual that the human should be the one left without a partner."
More clicking sounds came from the other Vextai instructors.
Marcus maintained his composure, even as he felt the weight of dozens of alien gazes upon him. "Perhaps," Zixara continued, "the human would prefer to observe the training rather than participate. There would be no shame in admitting that one species is not suited for this kind of work." The comment stung, but Marcus had expected something like this. He had spent months preparing for this moment, studying Vextai psychology and social dynamics. He knew exactly how to respond. "Commander Zixara," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly quiet hall. "I appreciate your concern for my safety, but I didn't travel 18,000 light-years to observe. I came here to hunt." The Vextai's compound eyes seemed to shimmer with something that might have been respect, though her next words suggested otherwise. "Very well, human. Since you are so eager to prove yourself, you will partner with me directly. I will personally oversee your training, which means I will also be personally responsible for keeping you alive long enough to realize your limitations." A collective intake of breath came from the assembled trainees. Partnering with an instructor, especially one as legendary as Zixara, was typically considered an honor reserved for the most promising recruits. But the way she phrased it made it clear that this was intended as a form of elaborate humiliation. "I would be honored to train under your guidance, Commander," Marcus replied, ignoring the implications and accepting the partnership at face value. Zixara's mandibles clicked again, faster this time. "We shall see how long your honor lasts, trainee. Report to Training Base 7 in 1 hour. Bring whatever equipment your species uses for hunting, though I suspect it will prove inadequate for our purposes." As the crowd dispersed, Marcus caught fragments of conversation in various languages, most of which centered around speculation about how quickly the human would wash out of the program. Some were placing bets on whether he would last through his first actual hunting exercise. Marcus made his way to the quarters that had been assigned to him, a small but efficient space that contained everything he would need during his stay at the station. The room's environmental systems had been adjusted to accommodate human physiology, providing the proper atmospheric mixture and gravity level. It was a thoughtful touch that made him feel slightly more welcome than the reception he had received in the main hall. He opened the storage container he had brought from Earth and began to lay out his equipment. To most observers, the items would appear primitive compared to the advanced technology used by other galactic civilizations. His main weapon was what appeared to be a simple rifle, its design clearly derived from ancient projectile weapons. His armor looked like little more than reinforced fabric compared to the energy shields and molecular barriers used by other species, but appearances could be deceiving, as Marcus knew better than most. The rifle's simple exterior concealed targeting systems that could track multiple moving objects simultaneously while calculating optimal firing solutions in real time. The armor might look primitive, but it incorporated materials that could disperse energy weapons and deflect claws that could cut through starship hulls. More importantly, both the rifle and armor were tuned specifically to human physiology and psychology. Where other species relied on overwhelming firepower or impenetrable defenses, humans had developed equipment that enhanced their natural advantages: adaptability, pattern recognition, and the ability to remain calm under pressure. Marcus spent the remaining time reviewing the files he had been given about Commander Zixara. Her service record was impressive, even by Hunter Corps standards. She had led successful expeditions against some of the most dangerous creatures known to galactic civilization, including several species that had been thought extinct until they resurged in remote sectors. Her hunting methodology relied on careful preparation, overwhelming force, and the kind of tactical precision that came from decades of experience. She was not given to taking unnecessary risks or deviating from proven strategies. This made her an excellent choice for training new hunters, as her students rarely died from preventable causes. It also made her exactly the wrong kind of partner for what Marcus suspected was coming. When the hour was up, he made his way to Training Bay 7. The space was designed to simulate a wide variety of hunting environments, its walls lined with holographic projectors that could create everything from dense jungles to asteroid fields. Currently, it was configured to resemble a barren landscape beneath an alien sky, the kind of place where void creatures like to make their lairs. Zixara was already there, along with several other instructors who had apparently come to observe the humans' first training exercise. She wore her full hunting gear, which transformed her from merely intimidating to genuinely terrifying. Additional armor plates enhanced her natural exoskeleton, and her forearms each carried a different weapon designed for specific types of prey. "You are precisely on time," she observed as Marcus entered the bay. "Punctuality is a virtue among hunters, though it will not compensate for other shortcomings." Marcus nodded acknowledgement and began checking his equipment one final time. The other instructors maintained a respectful distance, but he could feel their attention like a physical weight. "Today's exercise will be a simple stalking scenario," Zixara explained. "We will track and eliminate a shadow creeper that has been terrorizing a mining colony on the rim worlds. The creature hunts by manipulating darkness itself, creating zones of absolute shadow where it can move unseen and attack without warning." She gestured, and the training bay's environment shifted to match their scenario. The alien landscape darkened as false shadows began creeping across the terrain, some of them moving with unnatural purpose. The key to hunting shadow creepers is patience and proper positioning. We must force the creature to come to us, rather than allowing it to dictate the terms of engagement. Zixara's voice took on the tone of a lecturer addressing a particularly slow student. "Stay close to me, human, and try not to do anything that might get us both killed." Marcus activated his equipment and fell into formation behind the Vextai commander. The training scenario was sophisticated enough to engage multiple senses, filling the air with the sulfurous scent of the alien world and the distant sounds of industrial machinery from the simulated mining colony. They moved across the simulated landscape with careful precision, Zixara's forearms allowing her to maintain constant readiness with multiple weapons while also using scanning equipment to track their target. Marcus followed her lead, noting how she positioned herself to take advantage of whatever limited cover the terrain offered. The shadow creeper's presence became apparent gradually, marked by areas where the darkness seemed to move independently of any light source. Zixara held up one arm to signal a halt, then began the careful process of setting up an optimal firing position. "The creature will attempt to flank us by moving through the shadows," she whispered, her voice barely audible even to Marcus's enhanced hearing. "We must remain in the light at all costs, as entering the darkness means certain death." Marcus nodded his understanding while studying the pattern of moving shadows around them. Something about their behavior didn't match what he had read about shadow creeper hunting habits. The movements were too regular, too predictable for a creature that survived by being unpredictable. "Commander," he said quietly, "I think we're looking at this wrong." Zixara's compound eyes turned toward him, clearly annoyed by the interruption. "Explain quickly, human."
The shadows are moving in a pattern.
"See how they sweep from left to right every 43 seconds? Real shadow creeper behavior should be more chaotic." The Vextai commander looked more carefully at the approaching darkness, her expression shifting as she recognized the validity of his observation. "You believe this is a distraction," she said after a moment. "I think the real attack is coming from above," Marcus replied, raising his rifle to point at what appeared to be empty air directly overhead. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the space above them shimmered, and a massive form materialized as it dropped toward their position with deadly intent. Zixara's training kicked in immediately, all four of her arms moving in perfect coordination to bring multiple weapons to bear on the descending threat. But even her legendary reflexes might not have been fast enough if Marcus hadn't provided the early warning. The shadow creeper was even more horrifying in person than the training materials had suggested. Its body seemed to be made of living darkness that absorbed light rather than reflecting it, making it difficult to track even when fully visible. Multiple appendages writhed with purpose as it descended, each one capable of delivering a fatal strike. Marcus's rifle spoke once, its projectile designed specifically for creatures that manipulated electromagnetic radiation. The shadow creeper's form wavered as the specialized ammunition disrupted whatever field allowed it to control darkness, making it solid and vulnerable for a crucial few seconds. Zixara didn't waste the opportunity. Her weapons discharged in a coordinated barrage that would have been sufficient to disable a light military vehicle. The shadow creeper's form collapsed in on itself as its ability to maintain coherence failed completely. The training bay returned to its neutral configuration, and the holographic environment faded away to reveal the sterile walls of the practice facility.
The assembled instructors remained silent for several long moments, clearly processing what they had witnessed.
Impressive, Zixara finally said, though her tone suggested she was not entirely pleased with the outcome.
Your observation skills are better than expected, human. Marcus kept his expression neutral despite the faint praise. He had noticed something else during the exercise, something that might prove more important than his ability to spot an ambush predator. Zixara had fought exactly as her reputation suggested she would, with overwhelming force and tactical precision. But her response had been entirely reactive, based on established protocols and proven methodologies. When faced with an unexpected situation, she had adapted quickly but predictably. If Marcus was right about what was coming, that kind of predictability might not be enough to keep them alive. The weeks that followed Marcus's first training exercise established a pattern that became both routine and increasingly complex. Each day brought new challenges designed to test different aspects of hunting skills, from tracking creatures through impossible terrain to surviving in environments that would kill most sentient beings within minutes. Commander Zixara proved to be exactly the kind of instructor Marcus had expected, demanding, precise, and utterly committed to excellence. She pushed him harder than she pushed any of the other trainees, partly because of his species' reputation for fragility, and partly because their first exercise had demonstrated that he might actually survive long enough to be worth the investment of her time. The training facility's medical bay saw Marcus more frequently than he would have preferred. Humans, it turned out, did not respond well to the kind of punishment that other species considered routine. The gravity adjustments alone were enough to stress his cardiovascular system beyond normal limits, and the atmospheric variations in different hunting environments left him gasping for breath while his partners remained unaffected. But he endured. And more than that, he began to excel in ways that surprised even himself. His pattern recognition abilities, which had seemed merely adequate during his first test, proved to be exceptional when applied to more complex scenarios. He could identify the behavioral signatures of creatures that other hunters had never even heard of, picking up on subtle environmental cues that revealed hunting grounds, territorial markers, and migration routes. The other trainees began to take notice. At first, their attention had been dismissive, the kind of mild curiosity one might show toward a talking animal. But as Marcus continued to survive exercises that claimed other, supposedly superior hunters, their attitude shifted from amusement to grudging respect and, in some cases, genuine concern. Crixel, the scarred Krelnath warrior who had mocked Marcus during his first day, approached him after a particularly brutal training session involving plasma wraiths. The exercise had claimed two trainees, a Vextai and a Zephyrian, who had been caught unprepared when the wraiths shifted hunting strategies mid-engagement. Human, Crixel said, his reptilian features displaying what passed for confusion among his species. Your survival makes no sense according to any reasonable analysis. Marcus was in the process of cleaning his rifle, a ritual that served both practical and psychological purposes. The familiar motions helped him process the day's experiences while maintaining his equipment in optimal condition. How so? He asked without looking up from his work. Your species lacks natural armor. Your reflexes are slower than most. Your strength is inadequate for close combat with the creatures we hunt. Crixel's voice carried genuine puzzlement rather than malice. Yet you continue to survive scenarios that kill warriors who should be your superiors in every measurable way. It was a fair question, one that Marcus had been asking himself with increasing frequency. The answer was complex, involving factors that went well beyond simple physical capabilities or technological advantages. Maybe superiority isn't as measurable as we like to think, Marcus replied, finally looking up from his rifle. The plasma wraiths that killed our classmates today, they changed their hunting pattern because they were being hunted according to a specific methodology. When that methodology failed to account for their adaptability, the hunters became prey. Crixal's scaled brow ridge furrowed as he processed this statement. You suggest that following established protocols is a weakness? I suggest that following them too rigidly can be, Marcus said carefully. Every hunting manual in the galaxy talks about the importance of adaptability, but most hunters seem to interpret that as having multiple predetermined responses rather than the ability to improvise entirely new approaches. This conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Commander Zixara, who moved through the equipment bay with the purposeful stride of someone carrying important news. Her forearms gestured in patterns that Marcus had learned to interpret as signs of significant agitation. Training has been accelerated, she announced without preamble. All hunter pairs will begin live exercises beginning tomorrow morning. The assembled trainees exchanged glances of surprise and concern. Live exercises were typically reserved for the final phase of training, after months of preparation and simulation. Moving to actual hunting assignments after only 3 weeks was unprecedented. "What has changed, Commander?" asked Thisera, a Vextai whose hunting skills were considered exceptional even by the standards of her species. Zixara's mandibles clicked in the rapid pattern that Marcus had learned, indicated serious trouble. 3 separate Hunter Corps teams have gone missing in the past 10 days. All were investigating reports of unusual creature activity in the Proxima Drift, a region that has been peaceful for the past century. She activated a holographic display that showed the relevant sector of space. The Proxima Drift was a collection of dead systems between the spiral arms of the galaxy, the kind of place where nothing interesting was supposed to happen. It was occasionally used as a training ground for new hunters precisely because of its reputation for being safe. The missing teams were all experienced veterans, Zixara continued. Combined, they had over 200 years of active hunting experience. Yet something in the drift was able to eliminate them without sending so much as a distress signal. Marcus studied the displayed star charts, noting the positions where the teams had last been seen. The pattern of disappearances suggested something moving through the region systematically, but not randomly. Whatever was responsible was intelligent enough to plan its attacks. "Are we being sent to investigate these disappearances?" Thisera asked. "Negative. High Command has classified the drift as off-limits pending further investigation by specialist teams." Zixara's tone suggested she disagreed with this decision. However, the loss of 3 veteran teams has created a critical shortage of active hunters just as reports of creature activity are increasing across multiple sectors. She gestured again, and the display shifted to show a galaxy-wide overview marked with dozens of red indicators. Each one represented a location where dangerous creatures had been sighted or where hunting teams were urgently needed. Normally, trainee hunters would not be deployed to handle Category 4 or 5 threats. The commander continued. "Current circumstances require us to make exceptions to that policy. You will be given assignments appropriate to your skill levels, but those assignments will involve real dangers and real consequences." The implications of this announcement settled over the assembled trainees like a heavy blanket. Live hunting meant the possibility of actual death, not just the controlled dangers of training exercises. It also meant the opportunity to prove themselves as genuine hunters rather than students playing at violence. "Partner assignments remain unchanged," Zixara added. "Equipment requisitions will be processed immediately. You will receive your specific mission parameters tomorrow morning, along with transport to your assigned hunting grounds." As the briefing concluded, Marcus found himself considering the implications of what they had been told. The timing of their accelerated training seemed suspicious when combined with the mysterious disappearances in the Proxima Drift. 3 veteran teams didn't simply vanish without cause, especially not in a region considered safe enough for training exercises. That evening, as he prepared his gear for whatever assignment awaited them, Marcus received an unexpected visitor. Commander Zixara entered his quarters without announcing herself, a breach of protocol that immediately put him on alert. "You have questions about our conversation today," she said without preamble. It was a statement rather than a question, spoken with the confidence of someone who had spent years reading the behavior patterns of various species. "Several," Marcus admitted. "The most important being whether you believe the disappearances in the drift are connected to our sudden deployment." Zixara's compound eyes seemed to focus on him with greater intensity. "You think like a hunter, human. That is both encouraging and dangerous." She moved to his equipment locker and examined his gear with professional interest. Her 4 arms allowed her to manipulate multiple items simultaneously, checking the calibration of his weapons and the integrity of his protective equipment. "The creatures we hunt are not the most dangerous things in the galaxy," she said as she worked. "They are simply the most obvious dangers. There are older threats, things that have slept between the stars for so long that most civilizations have forgotten they ever existed." Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the environmental controls. "You're talking about the apex hunters." The reaction was immediate and dramatic. Zixara's 4 arms went rigid, and her mandibles snapped shut with an audible click. The very name seemed to have a physical effect on her, as if speaking it aloud had summoned something terrible from the darkness. "That name is not to be used lightly," she said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Most beings in the galaxy believe the apex hunters are legends, stories told to frighten younglings into obedience. But you know better," Marcus said. "I know that legends sometimes have basis in reality. I know that there are things in the deep dark that make our most dangerous prey look like harmless pets." Zyxara's examination of his equipment became more thorough, as if she were preparing for something far more serious than a routine hunting assignment. The Hunter Corps has protocols for dealing with various threat levels, she continued. Category 1 through 10, each with specific response procedures and equipment requirements. What we do not have are protocols for dealing with Category 11 threats, because the assumption has always been that such creatures no longer exist. Marcus absorbed this information while considering its implications. If the Apex Hunters were real, and if they were somehow connected to the disappearances in the Proxima Drift, then the sudden deployment of trainee hunters made a terrible kind of sense. "You're using us as bait," he said quietly. "I am following orders from High Command," Zyxara replied, but her tone suggested she shared his concerns. Whether those orders represent sound tactical thinking or desperate improvisation remains to be seen. She finished her examination of his equipment and turned to face him directly. "Your species is young in galactic terms, human. You have not lived through the cycles of growth and destruction that shaped the development of older civilizations. This may be an advantage." "How so?" "Because you do not know what is impossible. Other species carry the genetic memory of ancient fears, instinctive knowledge of threats that cannot be fought or defeated. Humans lack such memories, which means you may attempt solutions that more experienced hunters would never consider." It was perhaps the closest thing to a compliment Marcus had received from any of the instructors, though it came wrapped in implications that were far from reassuring. "Get some rest," Zyxara advised as she moved toward the door. "Tomorrow you will begin to earn your reputation as a hunter, assuming you survive long enough to establish one." Alone again, Marcus completed his preparation ritual and tried to get some sleep, but rest proved elusive, as his mind kept returning to the conversation with Zyxara and the implications of what lay ahead. Somewhere in the deep dark between the stars, ancient things were stirring. Creatures that had slept for millions of years were beginning to wake, driven by motivations that mortal minds could barely comprehend. And humanity, the newest and supposedly weakest member of the galactic community, was about to face them. The next morning brought their first assignment, delivered via encrypted data packet that required both Marcus's and Zyxara's authorization codes to decrypt. The mission parameters were straightforward enough on the surface. Investigate reports of creature activity on a mining world designated as Kepler 438. The planet itself was unremarkable, a rocky world with minimal atmosphere and rich mineral deposits that made it valuable to the various corporations that operated throughout the sector. The mining operation had been automated for the past 15 years with only a skeleton crew of maintenance technicians remaining on site. 3 days ago, all communication with the planet had ceased. Automated systems continued to function, suggesting that whatever had happened hadn't involved major infrastructure damage. But the maintenance crew had vanished without explanation, and preliminary scans from passing merchant vessels had detected unusual energy signatures in the planet's lower atmosphere. "Standard search and rescue," Zyxara said as they reviewed the mission data during their transport flight to the system. "Determine what happened to the missing personnel, eliminate any creatures responsible, and restore normal operations if possible." Marcus studied the geological surveys of Kepler F438c, noting the extensive underground tunnel systems that had been carved out over years of mining operations. The planet's surface was pocked with entrance shafts and ventilation systems, creating a complex three-dimensional environment that would be difficult to search systematically. "The energy signatures detected by the merchant scans," he said, highlighting the relevant data, "they don't match any known creature types in the databases." "Unknown does not necessarily mean dangerous," Zyxara replied, though her tone suggested she didn't entirely believe her own words. "Many creatures produce unique energy emissions based on their feeding habits or territorial behaviors. Their transport ship dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Kepler system, immediately beginning detailed scans of the planet while maintaining a safe distance. The results were disturbing enough to warrant additional caution. The mining complex showed signs of normal operation. Automated equipment continued to function. Power systems remained online, and communication arrays were undamaged. But thermal imaging revealed no signs of life anywhere on the planet's surface, and the unusual energy readings had intensified since the merchant ship's initial reports. "The energy signatures are moving," Marcus observed, tracking the patterns as they shifted through the underground tunnel systems. "Whatever is producing them is mobile and appears to be searching for something." Zyxara's mandibles clicked in the rapid pattern that indicated deep thought. "Searching behavior suggests intelligence. We may be dealing with a sapient species rather than simple predators." This possibility added an entirely new dimension to their mission. First contact protocols were complex and required special training that neither of them possessed. More importantly, Sapient species were capable of planning and coordination in ways that made them far more dangerous than even the most deadly predators. Their ship entered the planet's atmosphere under stealth protocols, using sensor-dampening fields to avoid detection while they conducted preliminary reconnaissance. The surface of Kepler. 4. 38C was a desolate landscape of brown rock and industrial machinery, broken only by the dark openings that led into the mining complex's underground levels. As they approached the main facility, Marcus noticed something that made him call for an immediate halt to their descent. "Commander, look at the equipment positioning around the main entrance shaft." Zyxara followed his gaze and immediately saw what had caught his attention. The heavy machinery that normally surrounded mining operations had been moved into defensive positions, creating interlocking fields of fire around all the major access points. The arrangement was too systematic to be accidental and too sophisticated to be the work of simple predators. "The missing maintenance crew," she said slowly. "They may still be alive and have barricaded themselves in the lower levels." It was a hopeful interpretation, but Marcus wasn't convinced. The defensive positioning was too perfect, too professional for panicked civilians trying to survive. It looked more like the work of someone who understood military tactics and had significant experience with siege warfare. As their ship touched down in a cleared area several kilometers from the main complex, Marcus found himself thinking about Commander Zyxara's warning about ancient threats staring in the darkness. Whatever had happened on Kepler? 4. 38C, he suspected it was going to prove far more complicated than a simple search and rescue mission. The planet's thin atmosphere required them to use breathing apparatus, adding another layer of complexity to their equipment loadout. Marcus checked his rifle's environmental seals, while Zyxara ran diagnostics on her multiple weapon systems. "Standard search pattern," she announced as they prepared to leave their ship. "We investigate the surface facilities first, then move into the underground levels if necessary. Maintain communication protocol at all times." Marcus nodded his understanding, though he suspected their communication equipment would prove inadequate once they entered the complex tunnel systems. The planet's high mineral content would interfere with most electromagnetic transmissions, forcing them to rely on line-of-sight contact or short-range emergency beacons. As they approached the main facility complex, the evidence of deliberate preparation became even more obvious. Supply caches had been established at regular intervals, positioned to support a prolonged defensive action. Weapons emplacements had been constructed using mining equipment and industrial materials, showing a level of engineering skill that went far beyond basic survival instincts. "This wasn't done by the maintenance crew," Marcus said as they examined one of the weapon emplacements. "The construction techniques and materials usage suggest military engineering training."
Zyxara's compound eyes studied the fortifications with growing concern.
"Which raises the question of who built these defenses and what they were trying to defend against." Their answer came sooner than either of them expected, announced by the distinctive whine of energy weapons charging in the darkness ahead of them. Whatever was waiting in the depths of Kepler. 4. 38C had noticed their arrival, and it was preparing to give them a very hostile welcome. The energy weapon signatures that had alerted them to hostile presence suddenly cut off, leaving behind a silence that felt more threatening than the original charging sounds. Marcus and Zyxara found themselves frozen in position, weapons ready, but with no clear targets in the maze of industrial equipment and defensive structures around the main mining entrance. "Tactical withdrawal," Zyxara whispered, using hand signals to indicate a fallback route to a position with better sightlines and cover. Her training emphasized the importance of choosing one's battlefield whenever possible, avoiding situations where the enemy held significant advantages. Marcus was about to comply when something made him pause. The defensive positions they had observed were sophisticated, but they were also incomplete. Whoever had constructed them had been working under time pressure, forced to improvise rather than implement a comprehensive defensive strategy. "Commander," he said quietly, "I think they're more afraid of us than we are of them." Before Zyxara could respond, a voice called out from the darkness ahead of them. It spoke in accented but understandable galactic standard, the words carrying a note of desperate hope that was unmistakable regardless of species. "Please identify yourselves. Are you Hunter Corps?" The question came from somewhere within the fortified positions, spoken by someone who was clearly trying to project authority while remaining safely hidden. Marcus and Zyxara exchanged glances, both recognizing the significance of what they had just heard. "This is Commander Zyxara, Hunter Corps Training Division, with Trainee Marcus Chen. Identify yourself and explain your situation." A long pause followed, during which Marcus could hear whispered conversations in at least 3 different languages. Finally, the original voice spoke again. Senior Mining Engineer Valdres Kane, Kepler Extraction Consortium. We have been under siege for 4 days by creatures that shouldn't exist. When we detected your ship approaching, we hoped you were the rescue team we requested. Zixara's mandibles clicked in frustration. No distress signal was received from this facility. Our mission parameters indicate complete communication blackout for the past 70 to 50 years. Another pause, followed by what sounded like bitter laughter. The creatures are jamming our communications somehow. Every time we try to send a message beyond the planet's atmosphere, the signal gets absorbed or redirected. We managed to get one partial transmission out before they adapted to our frequency patterns. This explanation raised more questions than it answered. Communication jamming required sophisticated technology or natural abilities that were extremely rare among known creature species. The fact that the interference was adaptive suggested intelligence and planning rather than simple predatory behavior. "How many survivors are with you?" Marcus called out, noting that Zixara seemed content to let him take the lead in the conversation. 17 people, including myself. We lost 6 team members in the first attack before we managed to establish these defensive positions. The voice carried the weight of someone who had watched friends die and blamed themselves for not preventing it. "Describe the creatures you're facing," Zixara commanded, reasserting her authority over the conversation. This time, the pause was even longer, filled with the kind of whispered debate that suggested the survivors disagreed about what they had actually encountered. That's complicated," Valdres finally admitted. "They don't look like anything in the biological databases. At first, we thought they might be some kind of advanced mining equipment that had achieved autonomous function. But their behavior patterns are too sophisticated for artificial intelligence." Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the planet's thin atmosphere. Creatures that resembled machinery but displayed complex behavior patterns were not unknown in the galaxy, but they were extremely rare and typically associated with very ancient technology. "Can you provide visual data?" he asked. "Negative. They emit some kind of interference field that disrupts most recording equipment. We have partial sensor readings, but nothing that would give you a clear picture of what we're dealing with." Zixara gestured for Marcus to maintain the conversation while she activated her communication equipment and attempted to contact their ship. After several tries, she shook her head to indicate that they were experiencing the same jamming effects that had trapped the mining crew. "We're going to approach your position," Marcus announced. "Please don't shoot us." "Understood. Follow the blue marker lights and stay low." The creatures have some kind of aerial reconnaissance capability. A series of faint blue lights began blinking in sequence, creating a path through the defensive maze toward what appeared to be the main entrance to the underground facility. Marcus and Zixara followed the lights carefully, both of them scanning for signs of the hostile creatures that had prompted such elaborate defensive measures. The entrance itself had been heavily fortified with mining equipment and industrial materials. Massive ore processors had been repositioned to create overlap in kill zones, while conveyor belt sections provided both cover and elevated firing positions. The work showed signs of hasty construction, but also demonstrated considerable engineering skill. As they approached the entrance, several figures emerged from concealment. Marcus counted 5 humans, 3 beings he didn't immediately recognize, and what appeared to be a Vexdai worker whose exoskeleton showed signs of recent damage. Valdres Kane turned out to be a middle-aged human whose usually neat appearance had been disrupted by days of combat stress. His mining consortium uniform was torn and stained, and his eyes showed the kind of exhaustion that came from too little sleep and too much adrenaline. "Thank you for coming," he said, though his expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced that 2 hunters would be sufficient to resolve their situation. "I wish I could say the situation has improved since our last transmission attempt, but that would be lying." Zixara's compound eyes surveyed the defensive positions with professional interest. "Your fortifications show military planning. Do any of your people have combat experience?" "Some," Valdres admitted. "Our security chief is former colonial marines, and 2 of our engineers served in the frontier wars, but none of us are equipped to deal with what we're facing." He gestured toward the entrance to the underground facility, where additional fortifications blocked access to the tunnel systems below. "The creatures control most of the lower levels now. We've been forced back to the surface facilities and this single access point, RA." Marcus studied the defensive setup, noting how the positions had been designed to funnel attackers into predetermined kill zones while providing multiple fallback options for the defenders. It was competent work, but it also suggested that whoever had planned it expected to lose ground gradually rather than achieve outright victory. "Tell us exactly what happened," Zixara commanded. "Start from the beginning, and include every detail you can remember." Valdres nodded, and began his account. 4 days ago, our deep mining equipment broke through into a chamber that wasn't on any of our geological surveys. The space was much larger than anything we expected to find at that depth, and our initial scans detected what appeared to be artificial structures. He paused to activate a portable display device that showed three-dimensional maps of the mining complex. The lower levels appeared as a maze of tunnels and chambers, with one section highlighted in red to indicate the location of the breakthrough. We sent a survey team down to investigate the chamber. Standard procedure for unexpected discoveries is to document everything before continuing mining operations. His voice took on the flat tone of someone recounting traumatic events.
The team found structures that didn't match any known architectural styles, but the materials appeared to be some kind of advanced alloy that our equipment couldn't identify.
Marcus and Zixara exchanged glances.
Ancient structures with unknown materials were exactly the kind of discovery that typically preceded very unpleasant encounters with things that should have remained buried. The survey team activated their mapping equipment to document the structures, Valdris continued. That's when things went wrong. The structures began to emit energy readings, and our communication with the team was lost almost immediately. What kind of energy readings? Zixara asked. Unlike anything in our databases. The patterns suggested some kind of awakening or activation sequence, as if the structures had been dormant and were responding to external stimuli. Valdris manipulated the display to show energy level readings over time. Within 6 hours, the entire chamber was generating massive electromagnetic interference. The pattern shown on the display made Marcus's blood run cold. He had seen similar readings in classified files during his preparation for the Hunter Corps, though those files had been marked as theoretical rather than based on actual encounters. How long before the creatures appeared? He asked. They manifested approximately 18 hours after the initial activation. At first, we thought they might be some kind of automated defense system responding to the presence of our mining equipment, but their behavior quickly became too complex for simple programming. Valdris activated another section of the display, showing the mining complex's security footage from the past 4 days. The images were distorted by electromagnetic interference, but they still managed to convey the essential details of what had transpired. The creatures that had emerged from the deep chamber were unlike anything in the known databases, just as Valdris had claimed. They appeared to be constructed rather than evolved, with bodies that combined organic and mechanical elements in ways that defied conventional understanding of biology. Some moved on multiple legs that seemed to shift between flesh and metal depending on the viewing angle, while others floated through the air using propulsion systems that left no visible exhaust signatures. What made them truly disturbing was the way they moved, with obvious intelligence and coordination. They communicated with each other using light patterns and electromagnetic pulses, worked together to overcome defensive obstacles, and showed clear evidence of tactical planning in their attacks. They've been probing our defenses systematically, Valdris explained as the footage showed creatures testing different approaches to the fortified positions. Each attack incorporates lessons learned from previous attempts. They're not just intelligent, they're studying us. Zixara's mandibles clicked in the pattern that Marcus had learned indicated severe concern. How many different types have you observed? At least 7 distinct variants, possibly more. They seem to be specialized for different functions: reconnaissance, direct assault, technical manipulation, and something we're calling command entities that coordinate the others. The implications of this information settled over Marcus like a heavy blanket. Creatures that displayed this level of organization and adaptability were typically classified as Category 8 or 9 threats, requiring entire squadrons of veteran hunters to contain effectively. 2 hunters, one of them still technically a trainee, were not equipped to handle such a situation. We need to evacuate the survivors and call for reinforcements, Marcus said quietly to Zixara. Negative, she replied. Our communications are jammed, and our transport ship lacks the range to reach the nearest Hunter Corps station without refueling. More importantly, if these creatures represent the kind of threat I suspect they do, allowing them to spread beyond this planet would be catastrophic. It was a cold calculation, but Marcus recognized the logic behind it.
If the creatures were indeed connected to the ancient threats that Zixara had hinted at, then containing them took priority over the lives of a few mining engineers and 2 hunters.
There might be another option, Valdris said, apparently having overheard their conversation.
The mining complex has industrial-grade demolition charges designed for breaking up asteroid fragments. If we could get them into the chamber where the creatures originated, we might be able to collapse the entire underground structure. Zixara considered this proposal, her compound eyes focusing on the structural diagrams displayed on Valdris's equipment. The charges would need to be placed precisely to ensure complete collapse. Any survivors would have time to escape to the surface and potentially spread to other worlds. Not if we time it correctly, Marcus said. an idea beginning to form in his mind. The creatures are studying our defensive patterns, which means they're predictable in their own way. If we can draw them into a concentrated attack on a specific target, we could trap most or all of them in the blast zone. It was a desperate plan with minimal chances of success, but it represented their best opportunity to prevent the creatures from escaping Kepler. 438C. The question was whether they could execute it without getting themselves killed in the process. What would we use as bait to draw them into position? Zixara asked. Marcus looked at the assembled group of survivors, then back at the entrance to the underground facility where unknown horrors waited in the darkness. Us, he said simply. We go down into the complex and make ourselves an irresistible target. The silence that followed his suggestion was broken only by the distant sound of something moving through the tunnels below them. Something large and purposeful that was slowly making its way toward their position. Whatever was down there had apparently decided that the time for reconnaissance was over. The real attack was about to begin. The sound from the tunnels below grew louder as Marcus outlined his plan to the assembled group. What he was proposing went against every principle of tactical thinking that had been drilled into him during training, but conventional tactics had clearly failed to contain whatever was lurking in the depths of Kepler. 438C. You want to deliberately enter their territory and antagonize them into a full-scale assault, Valdris said, his voice carefully neutral despite the obvious skepticism in his expression. That seems like an elaborate form of suicide. It is, Zixira admitted, her mandibles clicking in patterns that Marcus had learned to associate with complex tactical calculations. But it may be the only way to ensure that these creatures don't escape to threaten other worlds. She activated her own mapping equipment and began overlaying structural data from the mining complex with the energy readings that had been detected since the breakthrough. The resulting three-dimensional model showed the underground facility as a maze of interconnected tunnels and chambers, with the original discovery site glowing like a malignant tumor at the deepest level. The demolition charges will need to be placed here, here, and here, she continued, indicating structural weak points that would ensure complete collapse of the lower levels. The timing must be precise. Too early, and some creatures will escape. Too late, and we become casualties of our own plan. Marcus studied the layout, noting the various routes that could be used to reach the placement sites. Most of them involved traveling through territory that was now controlled by the creatures, making the mission extremely hazardous, even by Hunter Corps standards. How long would we need to hold their attention to ensure they're all within the blast radius? He asked. Valdris consulted his personnel database, cross-referencing the observed creature counts with the capacity of the various tunnel systems. Based on our observations, they appear to operate in coordinated groups of 20 to 30 individuals. We've documented at least 7 such groups, possibly more. To draw them all into the kill zone would require approximately 15 minutes of sustained engagement. 15 minutes didn't sound like much time in the abstract, but Marcus knew it would feel like hours when they were surrounded by hostile creatures in confined underground spaces. The fact that they would need to remain mobile enough to place demolition charges while fighting for their lives made the prospect even more daunting. We'll need a diversion to get the charges into position, Zixara said. Something that draws their attention while allowing one team to reach the placement sites. I'll handle the diversion, Marcus volunteered, earning sharp looks from both Zixara and several of the mining crew members. Negative, the commander replied immediately. You lack the experience and equipment for that kind of sustained combat. I will provide the diversion while you place the charges. It was exactly the response Marcus had expected, and exactly the kind of thinking that would get them all killed. Zixara was an exceptional hunter, but her methods relied on overwhelming firepower and tactical superiority. In the confined spaces of the mining complex, surrounded by creatures that had adapted to conventional hunting techniques, her approach would be ineffective.
Commander, respectfully, I think you're looking at this wrong. Marcus said carefully.
These creatures have been studying our defensive tactics for 4 days. They know how trained hunters operate, which means they'll be prepared for standard assault patterns. Zixara's compound eyes focused on him with the intensity that preceded either enlightenment or violent disagreement. Explain your reasoning, trainee. They've adapted to predictable behavior patterns, which means unpredictability becomes our greatest asset. You fight like a hunter because that's what you are, which makes your actions comprehensible to something that's been studying hunters. Marcus gestured toward the entrance to the underground complex. I fight like a human, which is something they've never encountered before. It was a risky argument, one that challenged fundamental assumptions about combat effectiveness and species superiority. But the circumstances were extreme enough to warrant unconventional approaches. Valdris cleared his throat diplomatically. If I may offer a suggestion, perhaps the optimal approach involves both of you providing diversions, while my people handle the demolition charges. We know the complex better than anyone, and we have experience working with industrial explosives. Both hunters turned to look at him, with expressions that clearly conveyed their opinion of civilians attempting combat operations. But Marcus found himself considering the proposal seriously. How many of your people have demolition experience, he asked. 4, including myself. We've all worked with the charges in question, and 2 of us are former military engineers. Valdris's tone became more confident as he outlined their capabilities. More importantly, we can move through the maintenance tunnels that the creatures may not have fully explored. The maintenance tunnels represented a significant tactical advantage. They were too small for most of the creature variants that had been observed, and they provided direct access to the structural weak points where the charges needed to be placed. That could work, Zixara admitted reluctantly, but it would require precise timing and coordination. Any breakdown in communication could result in the demolition team being caught in their own blast. Marcus was already working out the logistics in his mind. We use a simple timing protocol. Demolition team enters the maintenance tunnels when we begin our diversion. Charges get placed over a 10-minute window, with detonation occurring exactly 15 minutes after we start engaging the creatures. What if you're overrun before the 15 minutes are up? Valdris asked. Then you detonate the charges anyway, Marcus replied without hesitation. The mission objective is containment, not rescue. The harsh reality of their situation settled over the group like a cold blanket. They were essentially planning a suicide mission with the hope that their deaths would prevent something far worse from escaping into the galaxy. But before anyone could voice further objections, the sounds from the tunnels below suddenly intensified. Whatever had been approaching their position was now very close, and it was bringing friends. "Contact!" shouted one of the security personnel, pointing toward the tunnel entrance where shapes were beginning to emerge from the darkness. The creatures that appeared were even more disturbing in person than they had been in the security footage. Their bodies seemed to shift between organic and mechanical configurations, making it impossible to predict their capabilities or weaknesses. Some moved on legs that appeared to be constructed of living metal, while others floated using propulsion systems that made no sound. But what made them truly terrifying was the way they coordinated their movements. They emerged from the tunnel in a formation that maximized their coverage while minimizing their exposure to defensive fire. When the mining crew opened fire with their improvised weapons, the creatures responded with tactical movement that would have impressed veteran military units. "Fall back to secondary positions!" Valdris shouted, but Marcus could see that their carefully constructed defenses were already being overwhelmed. The creatures moved with impossible speed and agility, flowing around obstacles like liquid while maintaining their coordinated assault pattern. They used some kind of energy weapons that seemed to disrupt electronic equipment on contact, making the mining crew's technical advantages irrelevant. Within minutes, it became clear that the surface defenses would not hold for much longer. The creatures were probing for weaknesses while simultaneously preparing what appeared to be a massive assault force in the tunnels below. "Now or never," Marcus said to Zixara. "If we're going to do this, we need to start before they overrun the surface positions." The commander's mandibles clicked in rapid patterns as she made her final calculations. "Valdris, get your demolition team ready. Marcus and I will draw them back into the complex and hold their attention for as long as possible." "Wait," Valdris said, grabbing a piece of equipment from one of the supply caches. "Take this. It's a mining beacon that will let us track your position in the tunnels. If you can activate it at the primary blast site, we'll know when you've reached the target zone." Marcus clipped the beacon to his equipment harness, noting that it was designed to continue functioning even in high electromagnetic interference environments. The mining consortium might lack military experience, but their industrial technology was remarkably robust. 15 minutes from the time we enter the tunnels," Zixara confirmed. "Do not wait for confirmation if you lose contact with us." Without further discussion, the 2 hunters began moving toward the tunnel entrance. The creatures that were attacking the surface positions immediately took notice, some of them breaking off their assault to track the new movement. As they descended into the darkness of the mining complex, Marcus found himself thinking about the conversation he had overheard during his first day of training. Other trainees had been betting on how quickly he would wash out of the program, apparently convinced that humans lacked the necessary qualities to become effective hunters. They were about to find out just how wrong they had been. The tunnels below the surface were a maze of industrial equipment and structural supports, all of it now serving as cover for creatures that seemed to blend seamlessly with their mechanical surroundings. Marcus and Zixara moved carefully through the complex, following the route that would take them to the deepest levels where the original discovery had been made. The creatures followed them, emerging from hiding places that should have been impossible to access. They moved with the kind of coordinated intelligence that suggested a hive mind or advanced communication system, adjusting their tactics based on real-time observation of their prey's behavior.
"They're herding us," Zixara observed as they reached the first major junction in the tunnel system, directing us toward a specific destination rather than simply attacking. Marcus had noticed the same thing.
The creatures were applying pressure from specific directions while leaving other routes conspicuously open, creating a path of least resistance that led deeper into the complex. "Maybe that works in our favor," he said. "If they want us to go somewhere specific, that's probably where the rest of them are waiting. Or where they can trap us most effectively," the commander replied. But she continued moving in the direction the creatures seemed to want them to go. As they descended deeper into the mining complex, the evidence of the original breakthrough became increasingly apparent. The walls showed signs of hasty excavation work, and the air carried strange energy readings that made Marcus's equipment emit warning signals. Finally, they reached the chamber where everything had started. It was enormous, easily the size of a small city, and filled with structures that defied conventional understanding of architecture. The buildings, if they could be called that, seemed to grow out of the rock itself, their surfaces covered with patterns that hurt to look at directly. But what dominated the chamber was the massive structure at its center, a thing that combined organic curves with geometric precision in ways that suggested it had been designed by minds that thought in fundamentally different ways than any known species. And surrounding that central structure, moving with obvious purpose and intelligence, were hundreds of the creatures they had been tracking. All of them had turned to face the tunnel entrance, as if they had been waiting for the hunters to arrive. Marcus activated the mining beacon, sending the signal that would tell the demolition team to begin their work. 15 minutes from now, this entire chamber would cease to exist. The only question was whether he and Zixara would live long enough to see it happen. The hundreds of creatures arrayed throughout the vast chamber moved with a synchronized precision that made Marcus's skin crawl. They didn't attack immediately, which was somehow more disturbing than if they had launched into immediate violence. Instead, they seemed to be studying the two hunters, analyzing their equipment and behavior patterns with a kind of clinical interest typically reserved for laboratory specimens. "They're waiting for something," Zixara observed, her forearms holding different weapons while her compound eyes tracked multiple targets simultaneously. "This level of coordination suggests a command structure we haven't identified." Marcus checked the timer on his equipment display. 13 minutes and 47 seconds until detonation. They needed to keep the creatures engaged and in this chamber for that entire time, which meant finding a way to make themselves threatening enough to prevent retreat, but not so dangerous that the creatures would simply overwhelm them immediately. The central structure in the chamber began to emit a low-frequency hum that seemed to resonate through the rock itself. The patterns on its surface started to glow with an internal light that shifted through spectrums, visible and invisible to human eyes. Whatever this thing was, it was responding to their presence. "Movement at your 3 o'clock, Marcus warned, noting that several of the floating creatures were beginning to maneuver into flanking positions. Before Zixara could respond, the central structure's humming intensified, and something began to emerge from its base. At first, it looked like another of the hybrid organic-mechanical creatures they had been fighting, but as it fully materialized, Marcus realized they were looking at something fundamentally different. The entity that stood before them was roughly humanoid in shape, but constructed on a scale that dwarfed even the largest known sentient species. Its body combined technological sophistication with biological elegance in ways that suggested millions of years of refinement and evolution. When it spoke, its voice carried harmonics that seemed to bypass normal hearing and speak directly to the mind. "Young hunters, you have awakened that which was meant to sleep, until the stars grew cold." The words were in perfect galactic standard, but spoken with an accent that suggested the speaker had learned the language by analyzing the minds of those who used it. Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the chamber's temperature. "You are apex hunters," Zixara said, her voice steady despite the obvious strain of maintaining combat readiness in the presence of something so far beyond their experience. "We are the architects of ending," the entity replied, its massive form shifting as internal mechanisms realigned themselves. "We were ancient when your species first looked up at the stars and wondered what lay beyond their reach. We have slept through the rise and fall of empires, waiting for the galaxy to mature sufficiently for the final harvest." Marcus's mind raced as he processed the implications of what they were hearing. The apex hunters weren't just another dangerous species.
They were something that had been deliberately dormant, waiting for specific conditions before becoming active again. "What harvest?" he asked, though he suspected he didn't want to hear the answer. The entity's attention focused on him, with an intensity that felt like being examined by a microscope designed for viewing souls. "The harvest of complexity, the collection of all that sentient species have learned and created during their brief existences. We preserve the essence of civilizations before entropy claims them. You destroy entire species to preserve their knowledge," Zixara said, understanding dawning in her voice. "We elevate them beyond the limitations of biological existence. The process appears destructive only from the limited perspective of organic minds." The entity gestured, and holographic displays appeared throughout the chamber, showing star systems being systematically drained of life while their technological and cultural achievements were absorbed into vast mechanical constructs. "The galaxy has reached sufficient complexity for the final harvest to begin. The mining operation that breached our resting chamber was the signal we had been waiting for, proof that younger species had developed the technology necessary to accidentally awaken us." Marcus glanced at his timer, 9 minutes and 15 seconds remaining. He needed to find a way to keep this conversation going while positioning himself and Zixara for whatever final confrontation was coming. "You've been studying us," he said, gesturing toward the smaller creatures that continued to maintain their positions throughout the chamber. "Learning our tactics and capabilities. Your species is particularly intriguing, human. The others follow predictable patterns based on their evolutionary development, but humans display a randomness that defies analysis." The entity's form shifted again, and Marcus realized it was adapting its physical configuration in real time based on their weapons and positioning. "Random behavior is often the result of inferior mental processing," Zixara said, though Marcus caught the subtle undertone that suggested she was buying time rather than expressing genuine belief. "Normally, yes, but human randomness appears to be a conscious choice rather than evolutionary inadequacy. They deliberately choose suboptimal solutions when optimal ones are available, suggesting a decision-making process that values unpredictability over efficiency." The entity moved closer, its massive form somehow managing to seem graceful despite its size. "This presents an interesting variable in our harvest calculations. Most species follow evolutionary imperatives that make their responses predictable. Humans may represent a form of complexity we have not previously encountered." 7 minutes and 30 seconds. Marcus made a decision that went against every tactical principle he had ever learned. Instead of maintaining combat readiness, he lowered his weapon and stepped forward. "Then maybe you should let us live," he said. "If we represent a new form of complexity, destroying us would reduce the total amount of information available for your harvest."
The entity paused, its internal mechanisms cycling through what appeared to be intensive computational processes.
Around the chamber, the smaller creatures shifted restlessly, as if receiving conflicting instructions. "An interesting argument. Preservation of the unpredictable variable versus completion of the harvest protocol." The entity's voice carried harmonics that suggested genuine consideration. "However, allowing your species to continue existing creates unacceptable risks to the harvest process itself. What if we offered to help you understand human randomness instead?" Marcus continued, aware that he was improvising desperately but unable to think of any better approach. "You could learn more from studying us alive than from processing us as part of your harvest." 5 minutes and 47 seconds. Zixara was staring at him as if he had lost his mind, which was probably an accurate assessment, but the entity seemed genuinely intrigued by the proposal, its massive form cycling through different configurations as it processed the implications. "Cooperation with organic species is not part of our fundamental programming," it said after a long pause. "However, the unique characteristics you display do suggest that standard harvest protocols may be insufficient for optimal data acquisition." The entity's attention turned to Zixara. "Your species follows predictable evolutionary patterns. You hunt because you are biologically programmed to hunt. Your tactics are efficient because efficiency leads to survival. But the human chooses tactics that should lead to failure, yet somehow succeeds anyway. Human luck is legendary throughout the galaxy," Zixara said carefully, "though most species consider it more of a curse than a blessing. Luck implies randomness in the universe itself rather than simple biological inadequacy. If humans can access true randomness rather than pseudo-random patterns, they may represent a form of complexity that transcends biological evolution." 3 minutes and 22 seconds. Marcus realized that the entity was actually considering his proposal, which presented both an opportunity and a terrible risk. If the apex hunters decided that humanity was worth studying rather than harvesting, it might save his species. But it would also mean
abandoning every other civilization in the galaxy to destruction. The harvest has already begun in other sectors, the entity continued, apparently reading his thoughts through some form of technological telepathy. 7 civilizations have been processed in the time since our awakening. Their knowledge and achievements have been preserved in eternal matrices that will survive the heat death of the universe. But you could stop, Marcus said. If human randomness represents something you haven't seen before, then other species might have unique characteristics too. Maybe the galaxy is too complex to be reduced to simple harvest protocols. The entity's form underwent a dramatic reconfiguration, growing larger and more complex as additional systems came online. When it spoke again, its voice carried harmonics that seemed to resonate with the chamber's very structure. You proposed that the harvest itself may be based on incomplete understanding of galactic complexity. That preservation through absorption may actually reduce total information content rather than preserving it. 2 minutes and 8 seconds. Exactly, Marcus said, though he wasn't entirely sure what he was agreeing to. Complex systems often produce emergent properties that can't be predicted from their individual components. By breaking down civilizations into component knowledge, you might be destroying information that only exists in the interaction between different species. The smaller creatures throughout the chamber had stopped moving entirely, apparently frozen by whatever computational processes were running through their collective network. The entity itself seemed to be undergoing some kind of fundamental reconfiguration as it processed the implications of Marcus's argument. 1 minute and 15 seconds. If your hypothesis is correct, the entity said slowly, then the optimal preservation strategy would involve maintaining the galactic ecosystem in its current state while developing non-invasive monitoring methods to study emergent complexity patterns. That sounds like a reasonable approach, Marcus agreed, trying to keep his voice steady as the timer counted down toward detonation. 30 to 7 seconds. However, the entity continued, testing your hypothesis would require abandoning millions of years of established harvest protocols. The risk of losing irreplaceable cultural data during the experimental period may outweigh the potential benefits. 23 seconds. Marcus realized that they had run out of time and options. The entity was too alien to be convinced by human arguments, no matter how logical they might seem. In a few seconds, the demolition charges would detonate and everything in the chamber would be destroyed. But as he watched the timer count down the final seconds, something unexpected happened. The entity suddenly froze in place, its massive form going rigid as every system appeared to shut down simultaneously. What just happened? Zixara demanded, her weapons trained on the motionless creature. Marcus looked at his equipment display and felt his blood run cold. The mining beacon he had activated to signal the demolition team wasn't just a communication device. According to the readings he was seeing, it was also emitting a specific electromagnetic frequency pattern that was somehow interfering with the entity's operating systems. 7 seconds. The beacon, he said, understanding flooding through him. It's not just for communication. It's designed to disrupt unknown technology. 3 seconds. The smaller creatures throughout the chamber began to collapse as whatever network connected them failed completely. The entity itself remained motionless, apparently locked in some kind of system failure that prevented it from responding to external threats. 1 second. Marcus grabbed Zixara's arm and pulled her toward the tunnel entrance, though he knew they had no chance of reaching safety before the charges detonated. The explosion that followed was beyond anything Marcus had ever experienced. The chamber filled with blinding light and crushing sound as the carefully placed demolition charges brought down millions of tons of rock and metal. The central structure collapsed in on itself, taking the frozen entity and its paralyzed servants with it into oblivion. When consciousness returned, Marcus found himself lying in a medical bay aboard what appeared to be a Hunter Corps rescue vessel. Commander Zakira was in the bed next to him, her exoskeleton showing signs of repair work but her vital signs stable. "How long have we been unconscious?" he asked the medical technician who was monitoring their recovery. 4 days, came the reply. "You were both in critical condition when the rescue team pulled you out of the mining complex. Another few minutes and the structural collapse would have claimed your lives completely." Marcus processed this information while trying to piece together what had happened after the explosion. The mining crew? Did they survive? 14 of the 17 survivors made it to the surface before the detonation. The demolition team completed their mission perfectly. The technician's expression grew more serious. "What they found in the wreckage has Hunter Corps High Command very interested in your report. Over the following days, as Marcus and Zixara recovered from their injuries, the full implications of what they had discovered began to become clear. The entity they had encountered was indeed connected to the ancient threats that had been responsible for the disappearances in the Proxima Drift. Analysis of the wreckage confirmed that the technology they had faced was millions of years old and far more sophisticated than anything in current galactic databases. More disturbing was the discovery that similar sites existed throughout the galaxy, hidden in places where younger species had been conducting industrial or scientific operations. The mining beacon technology that had disabled the entity was quickly reverse-engineered and distributed to every Hunter Corps team. But the knowledge that such ancient threats existed changed everything about how the galaxy viewed its own security. Commander Zixara made a full recovery and was promoted to senior commander, with responsibility for developing new protocols for dealing with archaeological discoveries that might contain dormant threats. Her final report on the Kepler probe, 438C incident, became required reading for all Hunter Corps personnel. Marcus completed his training with full honors and was assigned to a special operations unit that specialized in ancient threat containment. His unconventional approach to problem solving, which had been mocked during his early days at the Academy, became the foundation for new tactical doctrines that emphasized adaptability over established procedures. But perhaps most importantly, the incident established humanity's reputation within the galactic community as something far more significant than previously recognized. The other species began to understand that human unpredictability wasn't a sign of inferior mental processing, but rather a unique approach to problem solving that could be invaluable when facing truly unknown threats. 6 months later, Marcus found himself back at Hunter Station Omega, this time as an instructor training new recruits. As he watched the latest group of trainees struggle with their first exercises, he remembered his own early days and the mockery he had endured from those who underestimated his species. The irony was not lost on him. The galaxy had spent years dismissing humanity as the weakest member of the galactic community, only to discover that their greatest strength lay in being fundamentally unpredictable. When faced with ancient horrors that had adapted to defeat every known tactical approach, sometimes the best solution was to do something that made no tactical sense at all. As he prepared to address his new students, Marcus caught sight of the latest recruitment statistics. Human applicants to the Hunter Corps had increased by over 300%, with species from across the galaxy specifically requesting human partners for high-risk assignments. The trainee human, who had been mocked for his presumption in thinking he could hunt alongside the galaxy's apex predators, had become something far more valuable, proof that sometimes the greatest threats required the most unlikely heroes to defeat them. And in the deep dark between the stars, where ancient things still slumbered in their hidden chambers, other entities took note of what had happened on Kepler 438C. The harvest protocols were recalculated, new strategies were developed, and the Great Awakening was postponed for another age. But they would return, as they always had throughout the cycles of galactic history. And, when they did, they would find a galaxy that was no longer as predictable or as vulnerable as they had expected, thanks to a species that had turned its greatest weakness into its most formidable strength. The human capacity for doing the impossible had saved not just one mining colony, but potentially every civilization in the galaxy. And that was a lesson that would echo through the ages, long after the stars themselves had grown cold and the final harvest had been postponed forever.